Brilliant. Thanks, Kate. Over to you to introduce yourself and your session.
Great. I can't see what slides are up, so we'll just have to hope that it's all going fine. Okay, so we should be looking at the title slide now. Is that right?
Yeah, that's odd. I wonder why you can't see them.
Don't know. Never mind. So I'm here to talk about scrub on peat, and I'm actually here to ask us what really is with scrub on peat. So my name's Kate. I work for the RSPB at Dove Stone. It's a blanket bog site owned by United Utilities and managed in partnership with the RSPB. We work really closely with UU. I work very closely with Ed Lawrence, and really we've developed our peatland restoration and our ambitions for woodland creation together over the last, I can't even remember, 15 years or so. I have to confess right now, as if this is some sort of AA meeting, that I am completely obsessed with peat, sphagnum and scrub all in the same place. So thanks very much to Richard and Lee. We've really seen some lovely examples of upland peaty habitats. They were vibrant, functioning, wet, scrubby, full of life, delivering high quality water, resilient against floods and droughts. And I bet it's really hard to set them on fire too. Next slide, please. Are we on the next one?
We are.
Brilliant, thank you. So 15 years ago, this is what our particular piece of the British uplands looked like. Open and heathery, classic British upland. Beautiful, right? So these scenes really are echoed many times across our uplands. For a long time, people found this a quite acceptable scene to see. But now we know better, and we've made efforts to bring some natural processes back into our peatlands. We understand that British peatlands are not all they could be. But my question for us is, do we really understand their full story and their full potential, or are we only looking one baby step along the line to recovery? Next slide, please. So at Dove Stone, we're working really hard together to raise the water table. So you can see picture top left. Those are peat dams that we put in very much like the Borders Forest Trust, using heavy machinery, using diggers. We've planted over 1 million handfuls of sphagnum moss. We're very proud of that number at the moment. You can see bottom left some of our recovering sphagnum communities. We cut lots of high fire risk monocultures like heather and Molinia. Fire is a massive concern for us and a massive risk. We do go on fire on a pretty regular basis, and every time we have a fire, it puts us a step backwards along the restoration journey. And because of the water table restoration work especially, our wading birds are responding really well. So you can see Dunlin in the centre and golden plover bottom right. And they're even starting to show resilience against probably climate change induced drought. So in areas where they have declined on the wider site, when we have drought years, they've either held steady or increased in number where we've done intensive water table restoration works. And that obviously means that we're holding a higher water table. We are probably releasing less carbon. We are doing a better job for resilience against drought. So there's lots and lots of benefits that are associated with peatland restoration. So we've been supported by the local community really wonderfully. They've given us about 45,000 hours of time in volunteering since we started together in 2010. But there's one picture we haven't talked about. That's the top right. This picture is concerning some of the conservation world and is causing some people to think that our restoration efforts are going backwards. And that is the natural regeneration of scrub on deep peat. Next slide, please. But scrub recovery on peat is happening across almost all the UK upland landscapes where intensive livestock grazing and wild deer browsing has been removed or significantly reduced. And this is happening whether we like it or not. Personally, I like it, with some caveats, but it does seem that there's not much we can do about it. So the land is in recovery, and I genuinely think scrub is a part of that recovery story. So I think one of the questions for me is, are we going to celebrate these strides that the landscape is making towards recovery, or are we going to lock ourselves into a cycle of expensive and ultimately pretty pointless efforts to keep the uplands open by trying to remove all the scrub? Next slide, please. And how would we remove it anyway? That's my next question. Top left picture. Oh, excuse me. So top left picture, would we burn it out? We all know that burning is damaging to peat. It releases huge amounts of carbon and ultimately makes the peat more susceptible to blanket colonisation of scrub through drying, cracking and exposure. So we can't burn it. Do we graze it off? In order to remove it all, we would probably have to go back to the days of cap headage payment sheep numbers. But scrub is not all that tasty, really. So the first things to go would be those precious peaty plants that we've been encouraging back. So things like bog rosemary, cross-leaved heath and cranberry. Large numbers of sheep would recompact any peat that's starting to recover and would erode the revegetated gully sides. Not to mention nutrient input to drinking water catchment, the need for supplementary feeding. Where would all those sheep go in winter? So we can't burn it, we can't graze it. Do we repeatedly control it mechanically? Do we cut it down? It'll only grow back, and pulling it all up on the scale needed would create significant bare peat, and just when we finally manage to get it vegetated as well. So there seems to be no solution to this horrible colonisation by scrub of our barren upland habitats. So what do we do? Because it looks like scrub on peat in Britain is here to stay. Next slide, please. Just checking in, you've got a picture of some real wet Sphagnum peatland.
Nice.
Is that it? Great. Okay. So why do we in the UK think that bogs can't be functioning, carbon sequestering, clean water providing, fire resistant, biodiverse places if they have trees on them? Other countries seem to manage with wet peat, sphagnum and scrub in the same place. So what is our problem? Is it really the scrub, or is it the condition of our peatlands? So let's face it, our British peat is utterly knackered. And that's the polite way of saying it. Even though we have mostly vegetated their bare peat and are making some small strides towards better water table and more sphagnum. But just because our bogs are green again, it really doesn't mean that they're fixed. So essential to a functioning bog is high water table and lots of lovely sphagnum. Now, some people will be a bit surprised about this one, but even I would agree that scrub dries out damaged peat. But the key part of this sentence for me is not scrub, but damaged peat. So is our problem really scrub on peat, or is it scrub on degraded peat that won't hold water? Next slide, please. So here's a thought. What if we could focus on adding wetness and sphagnum to our peatlands rather than on removing scrub? Do we think that that would make scrub in our peaty landscapes more acceptable? Could we become more comfortable with the idea of a complex and constantly changing environment that's difficult to predict and map? I know we as a conservation community have a problem with not being able to predict an end result, and we have a problem with not being able to accurately map things. So would we be more confident that the essential natural process of a high water table was back in place, and therefore could we accept scrub in that environment? So the sphagnum dominated pools that you see in these pictures were all created by our peat dam creation and sphagnum planting programme in areas where scrub is becoming more dominant after the exclusion of livestock to allow for revegetation. Now, we've only just started this, really. We've put in around about 40,000 gully blocks now, and we are starting to see some really nice intense patches of wetness and sphagnum dominance, but we could definitely do a lot more of this. So I think the process of raising water table is quite easy, really. We know what we're doing and we know how to do it. It provides multiple other benefits while managing the risk of scrub colonisation drying out damaged peat. So you get fire resilience, you get drought resilience, you get biodiversity gains. On these areas that you can see in these pictures, we're even starting to see golden plover using these scrubby wetter areas, and teal and snipe numbers have increased significantly here, not to mention odonata and amphibians. So we are seeing birds that we would classically think of as birds of open barren moorland actually using areas where we've got quite a bit of scrub. So there are areas that are going to be more tricky to tackle than these. So these are easy because there's obvious overland gullying, obvious paths of flow. But there are areas which look like apparently intact peat. They're hard, they're species poor. It's really difficult to get sphagnum to grow on those. Just because they're vegetated doesn't mean that they're functioning. So we think that these areas are transporting a lot of water below the surface of the peat, and cracking from drying from previous fires, pipes below the surface. So not natural, but peat pipes rather than man-made plastic pipes or anything. So transporting a significant amount of water below the surface. We think that a technique called deep trench bunding will probably give us significant wetting in these areas. And that could even be translated through to areas that are kind of gently sloping on the edges, which we saw in the chat earlier. We are also developing sphagnum mixes to get established on drier areas of peat. So like Richard says, it's time. We can put lots of things in place to help move that process on a bit. And for us, that's about water table and sphagnum. And I also think it's about scrub as well. So do we have processes in place that we can use and other processes that we can develop to make sure that areas where scrub is naturally regenerating onto deep peat can be fully saturated and therefore scrub's not a risk? And I must point out as well, love those pictures that Richard showed, but even I have not planted scrub onto deep peat. We have had some experiments around the moorland edge. All of our scrub on the deep peat is naturally regenerating. Next slide, please. So people who know me will know that I'm going to say something quite embarrassing now. I find this sort of picture, sphagnum, bog rosemary, all starting to hummock around scrub. I find these pictures super lovely. This, for me, is the very start of how a blanket bog should be looking. It's got scrub, it's got sphagnum, it's got wet peat, it's got some more specialist bog plants. And this is all starting to happen in Britain. It's amazing. So the added wetness in these areas that is allowing the sphagnum to do so well is because around the periphery of these areas we have blocked gullies and we have raised water table within the peat mass. So even if we're not seeing open water, we know that we can still put processes in place to improve water table within the peat body, which will mean that scrub hopefully will exist a dynamic relationship with species like sphagnum rather than become dominant. The point is really, though, that we don't want to end up gardening these environments. We want our land management to be natural process led. So if we can achieve that through water table restoration and sphagnum reintroduction, that will then dictate what scrub grows where on peat, then we're going to be really happy. Next slide, please. So at Dove Stone, and thanks very much to Ed Lawrence for these brilliant fixed point photographs. We've gone from extensive bare peat, active erosion, really very feeble vegetation communities in 2010, which is the picture on the left, to something that is much more robust, much more complex and wetter, and it's actually starting to support peat forming communities of sphagnum mosses. So the picture on the right was 2023. It's now also a peat landscape that supports quite a lot of scrub. So this is really significant progress, and I really believe that scrub is a part of that progress. But caveat here, we are still just a few baby steps along the road to a healthy bog. So for continued recovery with wet scrub as a valued part of the increasingly complex mosaic of bog habitats, we really need to up our game on rewetting and sphagnum reintroduction. And then if we can do that, next slide, please. Maybe some of our UK peatlands will look a bit more like this one day. Amazing. Next slide, please. And I am sorry, because that is not the end of the scrub on peat story that I wanted to talk about. Are we really going to invest millions of pounds into restoring the interior of our peatlands? And if we're lucky, millions of pounds into reintroducing scrub and open patchy native woodland to our moorland valleys and do nothing about the disintegrating edges of our peat masses? So this really is, for me, the peaty elephant in the room. So this picture is Dove Stone. We know more or less how to deal with restoration of the interior of our peat masses. We can raise water table, we can plant sphagnum, and we can welcome scrub with open arms as peat is saturated and covered in sphagnum. But what's the point of doing all this if our peat masses are still shrinking from the outside inwards? Not only are we actively losing peat from these edges, but the drawdown effect from the eroding edges mean that the peat behind those is very dry and vulnerable as well. So how do we fix it? Next slide, please. So I think you know what I'm going to say next. And anyway, Richard has given you an excellent education into the role of scrub as scaffolding for outward peat growth. In this picture that we see here, do we think that we're seeing willow scrub protecting the edge of an eroding gully from drying, from wind, from rain, so that sphagnum can colonise in the cool, damp shade beneath and the bare peat face can revegetate? I think we are. And I would like to think that in the very long run, that the scrub around these peat faces will enable outward growth of the peat mass as well. Oh, sorry. And the other thing we have to realise as well, of course, is that the edge of a peat mass is really quite a tortuous shape. So it's not only the straight line that goes along the tops of the valleys, but it's also the erosion gullies that go into the interior of the peat mass. So that's a lot of ground to cover, but how else can we protect these edges than by a welcoming scrub onto them? As long as we can, as much as we possibly can, saturate and sphagnumise the scrub behind those edges. So, you know, geojute would need constant replacement. Reprofiling would be many, many hundreds of kilometres, would be extremely expensive. And although you may have covered up the eroding peat edge, it would not necessarily give that peat mass something to grow into. Excuse me. So what if we were to find a natural solution where peat was working with us, which would only, where nature was working with us, which would only get better and more robust with time, and would also adjust itself to changes in the shape of the peat edge without our intervention? Next slide, please. We, as well as welcoming natural regeneration of scrub around these peat edges, we are also starting to use willow as a peatland restoration tool. So these pictures that you can see here are willow dams. So we use green willow. So these have been installed in erosion gullies coming off the main peat mass, but these erosion gullies are mineral based and are joining into the mineral based substrate on the big valley sides. As well as being great NFM, so natural flood management, and really supportive of biodiversity. We really want the willow recovery. So willow, multiple willows, aspen, that sort of thing. We really want these species to be act as a corridor for species moving up the hill in elevation as they adapt to climate change. So I'm pretty sure kind of man-made interventions like geojute won't do that. So next slide, please. So here you can see two pictures. So in places around the peat edges at Dove Stone, we've gone from bare and eroding peat with many complex bare edges. So the picture on the left, 2008, you can see the relict peat hags there, and the very recently seeded peat. And then the picture on the right hand side is the same piece of landscape. And this is obviously a much more stable piece of peat, vegetated and scrubby. So I think this scrub is performing a really valuable role in stabilising these peat edges. I personally would like to see more of this, as long as we can saturate and sphagnum the main body of the peat mass behind. We have done some work. So the main bodies of the peat masses behind these scrubby edges are quite complicated to re-wet because they're coming towards the mineral edges, because they've suffered from massive drawdown effects, because they've quite often been impacted by fire. They are cracked, they are supporting lots of peat pipes, they are transporting lots of water below the surface. So we're having some experiments into how we can actually retain wetness in those areas. Most of that is around peat damming at the moment. Definitely think there's a role for peat bunding as well. If we ever get consent to do it, I'll let you know how it goes. So at the moment, we're definitely achieving a gradation of saturation from really well saturated on the flatter tops of the catchment. So you remember that picture with the peat dams in it, to kind of patchily saturated towards the edge of the peat mass where slope and gullying is difficult. Sphagnum establishment will mostly follow the saturation. There we are experimenting with bespoke sphagnum mixes to try to colonise the drier peats. So I think we must expect to have a gradation of scrub going the other way, from more densely scrubby at the drier edges of the peat mass to hardly scrubby at all where the peat is very wet at the top. Excuse me. Now, this is what we want to achieve in, I don't know, 100 years maybe, as everything settles down and the complex interplay of natural processes finds a balance. In the meantime, I think we have to accept a bit of a weird intermediate scrub phase in our peatlands that we might not quite find naturally in a functioning system, as we put back as many natural processes as possible. Next slide, please.
Okay, 5-minute check from me.
Great, this is the last slide. Who would have thought? So I think some people might recognise this picture. So my vision really is of a saturated bog with open water, sphagnum and low-growing scrub, alive with waders, insects, beavers. This should be sat in a wider landscape of wooded valleys and patchily scrubby, flowery hillsides, linking all of this diverse and complicated loveliness, a fuzz of interesting willow scrub around the peat edges and veins of it flowing into the interior of the bog, up the big mineral-based erosion gullies. Only by taking bold and creative steps, and by learning from those that don't work quite so well, do we stand a chance of restoring a whole landscape. We need to remember that our peatlands do not exist in isolation from the rest of the landscape, but are an intimate and complicated part of it. We should not be aiming for easily mapped and categorised hard lines between habitats, but dazzlingly complex, constantly moving fuzzy boundaries. It is here, after all, at those fuzzy moving boundaries that biodiversity will be at its most glorious. And do you know what? We can do this. It's easy. We know how to make all this happen. What we lack is the support to achieve it. We need the political will. We need to broaden our minds. We need to let go of our preconceptions of what a British upland should look like. And we need to be willing to learn from outside the UK. And maybe we could do with a bit more long-term funding as well. Thank you very much. Done.
Okay, thank you. That was fabulous. If that's you at low energy, I'd love to see you at high energy. That was super inspiring.
I'm completely unmanageable at high energy.
Just amazing. Really love those principles of being driven by the natural processes and dynamic relationships and thinking about the whole system, and really interesting to see your approach to the natural scrub regen within the peat landscapes as well as at the edges. Lots of chat coming through, so we'll definitely come back to some of those questions towards the end of the session. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Catherine to present now from a lowland perspective, so a bit of a different starting point, I think, and it'd be really interesting to hear about how you consider tree and wood management in a lowland peatland setting.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?